The spotlight carved through the cigarette smoke like a golden knife, and for one perfect moment in 1962, Dean Martin owned the entire world. The Copa room at the Sands was electric that night. Every table filled with high rollers and Hollywood royalty, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and illegal money. Dean leaned into the microphone with that trademark slouch, a rocks glass dangling from his fingers like it weighed nothing at all, his voice sliding through Everybody Loves Somebody with the kind of effortless grace that made grown men weep and women forget their husbands' names. He was the king of cool in his kingdom of neon, where the rules were simple. Show up, sing pretty, make them laugh, and never let them see you sweat. The audience hung on every note, every perfectly timed stumble, every self-deprecating joke about his drinking. To them, Dean Martin was invincible. A man so relaxed, he seemed to be floating above the chaos of ordinary life, untouchable in his tower of bourbon and brilliance. But 300 miles away in a Los Angeles boardroom, the magic was breaking. MGM Studios, the roaring lion of Hollywood, the empire that had built legends and buried careers with equal efficiency, had just filed a lawsuit against Dean Martin for $5 million. $5 million. In 1962, that wasn't just money, it was annihilation. The studio that had made him a star was now trying to destroy him, claiming breach of contract, painting him as unreliable, ungrateful, a drunk who had finally pushed too far. The headlines wrote themselves, Dino versus the Lion. The gossip columnists sharpened their knives. The industry whispered that Dean had finally met his match, that MGM would make an example of the crooner who thought he was bigger than the system that created him. They expected him to settle quietly, to pay whatever it took to make the embarrassment disappear, to crawl back to the studio with his tail between his legs. They forgot something crucial about Dean Martin. The man who made everything look effortless had learned that skill in the steel mills of Steubenville, Ohio, watching his father come home with broken hands and unbroken dignity. The drunk act wasn't weakness, it was armor, carefully crafted to let people underestimate him, while he read every line of every contract with the precision of a jeweler examining diamonds. When Dean walked into that courthouse, he didn't bring an army of lawyers or a publicity team. He brought something far more dangerous, the quiet confidence of a man who had never broken his word and refused to let anyone else break him. The reporters expected a circus. The judge expected a performance. GM expected capitulation. Instead, Dean Martin looked at the most powerful studio in Hollywood, cracked a single, perfect joke, and reminded everyone in that room that sometimes the coolest thing you can do is simply refuse to be anyone other than yourself. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to 1962, to the moment when the King of Cool decided that some things were worth fighting for. By the spring of 1962, Dean Martin's name at MGM wasn't just ink on a contract, it was currency, traded with the same casual confidence executives used for words like profit and guarantee. 3 years had passed since he'd signed that 7-picture deal in 1959, back when the industry whispers said he'd never survive without Jerry Lewis, back when MGM's offer looked like salvation rather than ownership. The immigrant kid from Steubenville had climbed into immortality, his face 10 feet tall on theater marquees, the roaring lion's logo his crown. From the outside, it looked effortless. Of course it did. That was his gift. But inside the executive offices, Dean wasn't a legend. He was an asset, a line item on a ledger that needed to perform on command. The breaking point came on a warm Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled faintly of cigars and old victories. Dean sat at the polished mahogany table, the latest script in front of him, 27 pages of forced comedy, hollow characters, another variation on the theme they thought he should play forever. He turned the pages slowly, really reading, asking quiet questions about scenes that didn't ring true. The three executives in their perfect suits smiled their professional smiles, missing the steel underneath his sleepy eyelids and slouched posture. One of them laughed a little too loud, patted the script like it was a dog, and delivered the words that changed everything. "Don't worry about that, Dino. You're not paid to think. You're paid to show up and be Dean Martin." There it was. Not respect, not collaboration, ownership. They walked him through the schedule without asking if he had kids to see, a home to be in, a life outside the lens. Days bleeding into nights, location shoots into reshoots, publicity into rehearsals. It was all one long performance, and the person at the center was starting to feel like a prop in his own life. That night, in his study at home, the glamour fell away. No spotlight, no applause, just a quiet room and the stack of contracts he'd insisted on keeping, the ones he'd signed with hope and gratitude back when the studio's lion looked like protection instead of a cage. His daughter, Claudia, found him there around 8, no drink in his hand for once, just staring at those legal documents like he was reading his own obituary. When she asked if he was okay, he looked up with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than his 44 years. "Sweetheart, your old man just realized he sold something he can't buy back." The next morning, Dean picked up the phone. No theatrics, no rehearsed speech. Just a simple, steady sentence to his agent that felt heavier than any line he'd spoken on camera. "I'm not doing this picture." When the agent sputtered about renegotiation, Dean's response was soft but unshakable. "I'm not showing up." That was the crack in the golden cage. Small, almost invisible from the outside, but enough for light and trouble to pour through. At dawn, when the production office at MGM picked up the phone, they heard words no studio in that era ever wanted to hear from its star. Dean Martin isn't coming, and for the first time in his career, he meant never again. The news hit MGM's executive offices like a physical blow, arriving with the morning coffee and transforming a routine Tuesday into a crisis that would echo through Hollywood for decades. Dean Martin isn't coming. 4 simple words that shattered the illusion of studio omnipotence and sent 7 men in perfect suits scrambling around a mahogany conference table, their quarterly projections suddenly worthless paper. At first, they treated it like a scheduling glitch, a star's passing mood that could be managed with the right combination of flattery and financial incentives. But as the morning wore on and the reality settled in, Dean wasn't on the lot, wasn't in makeup, wasn't coming. Period. Something colder took hold. This wasn't temperament. This was revolution. By noon, the boardroom had transformed into a war room. Production managers calculated the immediate losses. 3 films worth $40 million in projected revenue, marketing campaigns already in motion, distribution deals hanging in the balance. But the real terror wasn't financial, it was structural. If Dean Martin could simply walk away from a signed contract, if he could decide that MGM's ownership was merely a suggestion, what stopped every other star from following suit? The entire system, built on fear dressed up as loyalty, began to crack. Someone used the word example, and the room went silent. The lawsuit they crafted wasn't just legal action, it was public execution. $5 million in damages, a figure so astronomical it would bankrupt most small countries. The 47-page complaint read like an indictment of character, breach of contract, willful refusal, unprofessional conduct, damage to studio reputation. Between every legal phrase lay a simpler message carved in stone. You don't walk away from MGM and survive. The publicity machine roared to life with clinical efficiency. Hedda Hopper wrote that Dean had lost touch with reality. Luella Parsons wondered in print if the bottle had finally won. The trades ran the numbers, painting a picture of career suicide wrapped in arrogance. The narrative was effortless to spin because Dean had spent years cultivating the very image they now weaponized against him. The charming drunk persona that had protected him for so long became evidence of his downfall. While Hollywood buzzed with gossip and speculation, Dean's Beverly Hills home remained strangely quiet. The thick envelope arrived by messenger, 47 pages of legal warfare stamped and signed. He took it into his study, closed the door, and did the one thing nobody expected. He read every single word with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned that working men get cheated when they don't read the fine print. Frank Sinatra called that evening, his voice burning with fury, ready to go to war for his friend. Dean listened, grateful, but there was a different fire in him, colder, sharper, more dangerous. When Frank asked what he was going to do, Dean's answer was soft but unshakable. "I'm gonna show up, Frank, but this time, not on their stage." 3 weeks before the trial, his daughter found him at 3 a.m, stone sober, holding a black and white photograph from his first day at MGM. He looked young in the picture, grateful, eager to please. When she asked what he was thinking, he traced the edge of the frame with his thumb and whispered words that would define everything that followed. "I'm remembering who I was before they told me who I should be." The lion had roared, but the man they'd mistaken for a harmless drunk was getting quiet, and in Hollywood, nothing was more dangerous than Dean Martin when he stopped performing. The morning arrived with that particular Los Angeles heat that made the air shimmer like a movie set, and Dean Martin stepped out of his car looking like he carried his own personal climate. The courthouse steps were already packed with reporters and flashbulbs, but he moved through the chaos with the deliberate care of a man who understood that everything in this city was performance, even refusing to perform. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his tie knotted just so, every detail calculated to project quiet authority rather than the charming drunk persona that had protected him for so long. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old paper and nervous sweat, packed tighter than the Copa room on New Year's Eve. Every seat was taken by industry insiders who'd laughed at his jokes and drunk his liquor, now here to witness his potential destruction like it was opening night entertainment. The gallery buzzed with that electric charge of witnessing history, the sense that this was bigger than contracts and clauses. This was about whether a human being could look at the machine that made him and simply say no. MGM's legal team filled their side of the aisle like an occupying army, 6 attorneys in matching gray suits, carrying briefcases thick with documentation designed to bury one man's career. They moved with the confidence of men who'd never lost, who represented an institution that had destroyed careers with less effort than it took to greenlight a picture. When the proceedings began, their lead attorney painted Dean as chaos incarnate, his voice grinding through accusations of unreliability, unprofessionalism, and financial recklessness. The prosecution's case unfolded with surgical precision. They called production managers who referenced missed meetings, accountants who presented charts showing cascading damage, executives who testified about lost revenue with the passion of men describing personal betrayal. Each witness added another brick to the wall they were building around the defendant, talking about him like he wasn't there, like he was a defective product that had failed to perform its function. Then came the character assassination, subtle at first, then brutal. Former colleagues took the stand with regretful expressions, describing Dean as difficult, unpredictable, unreliable. They used his stage persona against him, twisting the king of cool into a caricature of an irresponsible drunk who didn't respect the hard work of others. Dean sat through it all in absolute stillness, his heavy-lidded eyes taking in every betrayal, every twisted truth, every attempt to reduce his life to a breach of contract. His hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the table edge when people he'd worked beside painted him as the villain in a story where he was just trying to remain human. But then the prosecution made a crucial mistake. In their effort to show the jury exactly what the studio was losing, they played clips from his recent films. Suddenly there was Dean on the wall, charming, brilliant, effortlessly magnetic. The mood in the room shifted. You could feel it. The jury wasn't seeing a breach of contract anymore. They were seeing a star, and some of them were smiling, despite themselves. When the prosecution finally rested, the silence was heavy with expectation. They had thrown everything they had, painted him as villain and failure. The judge turned to the defense table, expecting a lengthy rebuttal, a parade of counter-witnesses. Dean's attorney stood slowly, straightening his jacket, and delivered 5 words that sucked the air out of the room. The defense calls Dean Martin. Every head turned. MGM's attorneys smirked, leaning back in their chairs, ready for what they thought would be the final kill. They had no idea that the wolf was already in the room. Dean rose from his chair with the same unhurried grace he used walking onto a stage, but this time the slouch was gone, the protective armor of casual indifference stripped away. He moved to the witness stand like a man who'd spent his entire life reading rooms, understanding that juries were just audiences who needed truth instead of entertainment. The sound in the courtroom shifted from chatter to something close to reverence as he approached the Bible, and when he placed his hand on it to take the oath, his voice carried that warm baritone stripped of all performance, clear and steady as bedrock. His attorney began with the gentlest possible question, almost conversational in its simplicity. "Mr. Martin, why did you become an entertainer?" The prosecution started to object, then stopped, sensing the trap too late. Dean leaned forward slightly, looking past the legal teams, past the judge, directly into the faces of the jury. A tired mother in the back row, a young man who couldn't meet his eyes, an older gentleman who'd probably grown up listening to the radio before the war. "I grew up in a house where English wasn't the first language," Dean said, his voice low and clean of any exaggerated slur people expected. "My father worked in a steel mill in Ohio, came home every night with hands so torn up he could barely hold a fork. But on Sundays, when we'd sing together, I'd see him smile. That's all I ever wanted to do, make people forget their troubles for a little while, make it easier for them to breathe for a couple minutes. If they were laughing, if they were clapping, then for a moment, things were okay. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was nakedly honest, and the jury felt it. The judge felt it. Even some of the reporters lowered their pens. The courtroom went still, and in that silence, everyone realized they weren't watching a movie anymore. This was something real, and it cut through the legal theater like a knife through silk. Then came the cross-examination, and the temperature changed like a storm front moving in. MGM's lead prosecutor rose with barely concealed contempt, determined to dismantle this moment of sincerity. He attacked with surgical precision, his questions designed to rattle, to expose, to force Dean into the role of the unreliable artist who thought he was above the rules. He hammered at missed meetings, questioned Dean's commitment, implied that success had made him forget his obligations. The questions grew sharper, more hostile, building toward the moment he thought would break the witness. Dean answered each barb with polite brevity, refusing to take the bait. His hands remained steady on the witness stand rail. His voice never rose. The prosecutor grew frustrated, his face reddening, his questions becoming more personal, more desperate. He needed Dean to crack. He needed the temperamental star, the drunk, the diva, but he got only dignity, and it was driving him to distraction. Finally, red-faced and desperate, the prosecutor made his fatal error. He sneered, gesturing broadly at the stack of contracts on his table, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you really expect this court to believe that you, a man famous for holding a drink in his hand, understood the complexities of these agreements better than the studio's legal department?" The courtroom went dead silent. It was a cheap shot, an insult wrapped in a question, and everyone knew it. Dean looked at the prosecutor for a long beat, those heavy-lidded eyes suddenly sharp as broken glass. Then a slow, familiar smile touched the corners of his mouth, and his timing became absolutely perfect, the timing that had made him a star, now deployed in service of simple truth. "Your Honor," Dean said, leaning slightly into the microphone, "I may play a drunk on stage, but I read contracts better sober than whoever wrote this one did drunk. The laughter didn't just ripple, it exploded. It started small, a single juror trying to suppress a smile, then spread outward like a stone dropped in still water. It caught the gallery, infected the jury, and even cracked the judge's stern composure. The prosecutor's face went crimson as he realized what had just happened. Dean hadn't just made a joke, he'd revealed the entire charade. He'd acknowledged his persona while demonstrating his intelligence, admitted the performance while proving he was nobody's fool. But Dean didn't stop there. His voice turned serious again, the laughter fading as he spoke directly to the jury with the quiet authority of a man who had found his footing. I honored every commitment I made, every single one. What I didn't agree to was being owned. There's a difference between doing your job and becoming someone else's property. I signed a contract to make pictures. They tried to sign away my life. The words landed like hammer blows, simple, true, devastating. For the next hour, Dean dismantled the studio's case not with legal jargon, but with common sense and undeniable integrity. He revealed a man who had kept meticulous records, who had honored his word, while the studio stretched their agreements beyond recognition. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, the energy in the room had completely transformed. The invincible studio looked small and petty. The unreliable star looked like the only adult in the room. Outside during the recess, Dean lit a cigarette in the afternoon sun, his hand steady as stone. A young actor, waiting for his own minor hearing in another courtroom, approached nervously, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe the way Dean had refused to break under pressure. Maybe the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. "Mr. Martin," the kid stammered, eyes wide with the desperate attention of someone learning how to survive. "Aren't you scared?" Dean took a slow drag, exhaled a plume of smoke into the California sunshine, and looked at the young man with those eyes that had seen everything Hollywood could throw at a person. When he smiled, it was that crooked smile that had launched 1,000 imitations, but warmer now, more real. "Kid," he said softly, "I was scared when I walked in. Now, I'm just free. The only thing to be scared of is forgetting who you are when the lights go out." He took another drag, stubbed out the cigarette, and turned back toward the courthouse doors, walking into whatever verdict waited for him, with the same unhurried grace he used to walk onto a stage, except now, for the first time in years, he wasn't performing for anyone but himself. The jury returned after exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes, which in the language of courtrooms meant something definitive had crystallized behind those closed doors. The air had thickened into something almost solid during the wait, a palpable tension that made breathing difficult for everyone except the man at the center of it all. Dean sat perfectly still at the defense table, hands folded calmly in his lap, not whispering calculations or legal strategies like the attorneys around him. He was thinking in costs, not financial ones, but human ones. His reputation, his children growing up in a town that measured worth in headlines, his right to look at himself in the mirror and recognize the face staring back. MGM's legal team had transformed from confident predators into brittle statues, their earlier arrogance replaced by nervous stillness as they watched the jury file back in. But these 12 ordinary people didn't look at the floor or avoid eye contact. They looked directly at Dean, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that something unprecedented was about to happen. The foreman stood, a weathered man who looked like he'd worked with his hands before landing on this jury, and when the judge asked for the verdict, his voice carried clear across the silent room. "We find in favor of the defendant, Dean Martin, on all counts." The words hit like hammer blows, count after count, accusation after accusation, each one falling away like dead leaves. By the time the last count was read, the unbeatable studio, the roaring lion that had devoured careers for breakfast, had lost completely. Dean's reaction was so quiet, it was almost invisible. No fist pump, no triumphant glare at the prosecution table. He simply closed his eyes for one breath, let out air he seemed to have been holding for months, then turned to his attorney with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said, shaking hands with the firm warmth of a man who understood that real victory doesn't need a parade. It just needs to be true. The courthouse steps erupted into chaos as reporters mobbed him, shouting questions about vindication and victory. Dean waved them off with that familiar, gentle deflection, climbed into his car, and drove away into Los Angeles traffic like any commuter heading home after work. MGM's damage control machine immediately issued statements claiming moral victory while the legal defeat still burned. But the industry knew what had really happened. The balance of power had shifted, not dramatically, but definitively. In the months that followed, the ripple effects became clear. Agents quietly invoked the Martin case in contract negotiations. Studios, suddenly aware that juries could side with people over corporations, softened their sharpest clauses. Actors who'd watched from the safety of silence now asked different questions when facing executives. The machine didn't break, but it learned it couldn't grind quite as carelessly as before. For Dean, the victory unfolded in freedom. The television variety show that became his masterpiece performed on his terms. The Vegas residency as his playground, not his prison. Films he chose instead of ones chosen for him. He had won back the right to be human in an industry built on selling souls. Years later, Dean Paul Martin found the court transcripts in his father's study, reading late into the night the quiet dignity of those answers, the refusal to be diminished. Over breakfast the next morning, Dean was scrambling eggs with his usual unhurried grace when his son asked about the trial. "Some things you don't talk about, you just do," Dean said, sliding eggs onto a plate. "They wanted me to be small so they could feel big. I just refused to shrink. That's not heroism, kid. That's just deciding you'd rather lose everything than lose yourself." In that quiet kitchen moment, Dean Paul understood that his father hadn't just won a lawsuit. He'd proven that sometimes the coolest thing you can do is simply refuse to be anyone other than yourself, even when it costs you everything. Decades later, when the bright lights of the studio era had dimmed into memory and MGM's roaring lion was more nostalgia than menace, the story of Dean Martin's trial lived on in whispered conversations at Musso and Frank's, passed down from veteran actors to nervous newcomers like a sacred text. In a 1987 interview, Robert Mitchum leaned back in his weathered chair and spoke with uncharacteristic reverence. "Dean did what the rest of us were too scared to do. After that trial, when my agent sat down with the studios, suddenly there was a little more room to breathe. We never said Dean's name out loud, but it was always there in the room, like a ghost protecting us." Frank Sinatra spoke about it only once on record, during a late-night conversation caught by documentary cameras in 1991. His blue eyes went distant as he swirled bourbon in a glass, remembering those tense weeks before the verdict. "I fought them with my fists, with my voice. I screamed until the walls shook," Frank admitted, his voice soft with something close to wonder. But Dino did something harder. He beat them by being quiet. He let them think they were winning right up until the moment they lost. That takes knowing exactly who you are when the room goes dark. That's a kind of strength most men don't have. The deeper truth about Dean Martin's character emerged slowly, pieced together from 100 small moments the trial had illuminated. Friends spoke of unmarked envelopes appearing after someone was quietly let go, stuffed with enough cash to make rent, signed with Dean's careful handwriting, but never his name. A widowed wardrobe assistant received anonymous payments for months after her husband died, never realizing who was behind them until her grandson traced the checks years later. The pattern was always the same: generosity done in darkness, kindness with the lights off, the sensitive man protecting himself behind the armor of the lovable drunk. His daughter Deanna found the court transcripts decades after his death, tucked between sheet music and old photographs in a leather portfolio. She read her father's testimony through tears, finally understanding why he'd always taught his children that strength doesn't require volume, that dignity means keeping your word even when others break theirs. "He never talked about the trial," she said years later, "but now I understand why he'd get so quiet when we complained about people being unfair. He'd just say, 'You can't control what they do, only what you do.' I thought it was just dad advice. Now I realize it was the philosophy that saved his life. The legacy of that courtroom moment extends beyond Hollywood contracts into something fundamental about choosing authenticity when the world demands compromise. Dean Martin had spent his career making the difficult look effortless, but the trial revealed the true cost of that cool, the constant vigilance required to protect your humanity in a system designed to commodify. He proved you could be successful without being owned, that you could play the game without losing yourself in it. In his final years at Bally's in Las Vegas, there were moments when the mask would slip. The band would hit the opening notes of Everybody Loves Somebody, and Dean would pause, just for a heartbeat, looking out at the audience with those heavy-lidded eyes that had seen everything. In that pause, you could glimpse the man who'd walked into a courtroom and refused to break, the immigrant son who'd discovered that the real victory wasn't the climb to the top. It was remembering who you were before the ascent began. One night in 1993, the cameras caught such a moment. Dean stood alone on stage after the final note faded, applause washing over him like warm water. He smiled that crooked smile, but his eyes were somewhere else, maybe back in that courtroom, maybe in his father's house in Steubenville, maybe just in the quiet space where a man goes when he's made peace with his choices. In a town built on illusion, he had chosen to be real. In a system designed to own souls, he had kept his. And that, in the end, was the greatest performance of all, the day he stopped performing and simply told the truth.